Hi, in this video we're going to start looking at how to add animations to a 2D game in Unity. There are a few different ways that you can add animations to a game. The first method is transform animations, which is when you animating a change in position, rotation or scale of a sprite over time. Alright, so for example, if I wanted this platform here to move back and forth, I could animate the position of the platform over time. I could make it move left and right and animate that movement. The second method is frame by frame animation, and that's where you change the sprite's image each frame using either individual images for every frame in the animation or by using a sprite sheet, which is a file that contains a whole bunch of images that can be for each frame of the animation. We're going to look at that in this video as well. And the third method is setting up animations with an animation controller and using some code. So for example, if for the player, we wanted to have a walking animation for when the player is walking and a running animation for when the player is running, and maybe have a jump animation or an animation for climbing a ladder or when there's collision with an enemy, and that kind of thing. What we can do is have different animations, and those animations can play based on variables in the game, such as the speed of the player or whether they're touching another object in the scene. And all of that can be controlled through code. So we're going to look at that in the next few videos, but in this video what we're going to look at is transform animation and frame by frame animation. So for an example of transform animation, what I'm going to do here is I've selected this platform here, and this platform actually has some other child objects attached to it. So it's got grass and on top and below the platform. So I want to animate all of that. I want the grass moving with the platform. So I'm going to select the parent object, and that's what I'm going to be animating. And I'm going to make it move back and forth. So to do that, I'm going to click on Window and open up the animation panel. All right, and rather than just have this floating around, I'm going to drag that tab down to my bottom panel here and snap that to the bottom panel. All right, so once you've selected the sprite, the object that you want to animate, you click on Create to create a new animation, and you can either save it in the Assets folder, or within that you can make a new folder. I'm going to make a new folder called Animations within the Assets folder, and I'm going to call this Animation Moving Platform. All right, now you will see the timeline here representing each frame in the animation, and you can add different types of animations by clicking Add Property and then revealing Transform, and you'll be able to see that you can add an animation for the position, rotation or scale of the asset that's selected. Now you can also, because this is an asset that has some child assets attached to it, like the grass, you can actually animate those individually as well. So if I wanted to animate the grass separate to the platform, I could also add some animations to that. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to do this for the entire platform. I'm going to click on Add Property, Transform, and then I'm going to animate the position of this platform. So I'm going to click the plus next to position. If I wanted to make this platform spin, then I could add a rotation animation. If I wanted it to get bigger or smaller over time, I could also add a scale animation. But I'm going to click plus next to position. All right, so now that property is added to the timeline and we can animate it. Now, these little diamonds here on the timeline represent keyframes, so where there's a change in the animation, and you might by default have a couple of keyframes there. So I'm going to click on this last one here. I'm just going to delete it because I don't need that. I'm going to add my own keyframes to the animation. Now, you can either manually add keyframes, so you could, using the Move tool, you could change the position of the maybe move ahead on the timeline and change the position of the platform, and then you can click this little button here to add a keyframe, and it's going to lock in that position at that point in time on the timeline. But what I'm going to do instead, I'm just going to go back to the start of the timeline, and I'm going to position the platform where I want it to be at the start of the animation, and I basically want it to move back and forth like that. Okay, so I'm going to position it where I want it to be at the start of the animation. And what I'm going to do here is click this little red button here, which enables keyframe recording mode. So when you click that and it's enabled, what that means is that any change that you make to the position of this object that's selected, the platform, that is going to be recorded into the animation. So depending on where you are on the timeline. So if I go to the very first frame of this timeline and position it where I want it to be at the start, just there, or about there. All right, that's going to be now a keyframe, so it's going to be locked in at that position at that point in time. Now if I move ahead, maybe I'm just going to drag the slider to the 10th frame. So if I move about 10 frames ahead, I'm going to say that I want to have the platform over this side after 10 frames. All right, so now you can see there's a little diamond added there, which means there's a new keyframe there on the 10th frame. So if I drag this bar back and forth, we can see that an animation's being created between those two keyframes on the timeline, moving the platform between those two locations. All right, now I want this animation to loop. So I want it to be able to move to the right. I want the platform to move from the left side to the right side and then back to the left again. So I'm going to move now to the 20th frame. I'm going to click on the 20th frame. And I'm going to move the platform back to its original starting point and add that as a keyframe. Now to do that, rather than just manually dragging it back, I'm going to find out exactly where it was at the start of the animation. So I'll just go back to the very first frame, have a look over here in the inspector panel at the position on the x-axis. And its position, it was 2.01. So I'm going to copy that. I'm going to move down to the 20th frame. I'm going to paste in that position, hit enter or return on the keyboard, and now we can see that the platform's moved back to the left. So there we have it. We've got a looping animation of the platform moving back and forth. We can click play to see a preview of it. And at the moment, it's moving way too fast, so I'm going to slow that down in a minute. But what I need to remember now is just to click on this button again to disable keyframe recording mode. Because if I keep that on, any change that I make now, if I go and move the platform, that's going to actually be recorded as an animation. So to stop recording changes and putting them into the animation, I'm going to click that to disable keyframe recording mode. And I'm going to change the number of samples per second in this animation, or number of frames per second. And I can do that from here. Now, if you don't see this box here where it says samples, what you'll need to do is go over to these three little dots here and click on that. Go down and click on show sample rate, make sure that that's checked. All right, if that's checked, then you should see the samples box here, and you can type in however many frames you want per second. So if I change that to 10, slows down quite a bit. I might even make it slower than that. I'm going to make it 6 samples. All right, so make sure when you change the number there, you press return or enter on your keyboard. And that's pretty good. Okay. Also, you can move back and forth on the timeline, and you can scroll on your mouse or keyboard to zoom in and out on the timeline so you can see fewer or you can see more frames. All right, so we've got 3 keyframes here, one for the position at the start of the animation where the platform's over the left, one for when it's over on the right, and another for when it moves back to the left, and that's just constantly looping, it's repeating. All right, let's click play to view that in the game and test it out. Okay, so now I can jump on this platform, and not only is the platform moving, but the collider is also attached to it as well, so that's moving with it. All right, next what we're going to look at is how to add frame by frame animation. So that's where we can change the image that's being used for a sprite each frame. So for example, what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some green sort of bubbles coming up here. So I'm going to imagine this is a bit of a swamp here, and there's some green like toxic bubbles coming up. So I've actually already created an animation. I've used Piskel to do this. And you could use another app like Aseprite, or you could draw individual frames in another program like Adobe Illustrator. But I've drawn each frame here, so I've got roughly 9 or 10 frames in here. You can see that's what the animation looks like, these bubbles rising up. And if I go and have a look here, it's 64 by 64 pixels, so 64 pixels wide, 64 pixels high. We'll need to remember that later. And when I export this animation, there's a couple of options I have, and it's going to be similar if you're using another app like Aseprite. What you can do is either download each individual frame, so each of these frames here for the animation, as separate images. So this would download them as separate PNG images. Or what you can do is download a sprite sheet. And a sprite sheet is basically one image file, but in that image, it's got a grid. It's got each frame of the animation laid out in a grid, in columns and in rows. All right, so I've already done that. I downloaded this animation earlier, so I'll show you what both look like. This is the folder containing all of the separate images. All right, so if I have a look at those and go through them, we can see each frame of the animation is a separate image. Okay, and here I have, this is an example of the sprite sheet. So if I open that up, we can see it's actually containing each frame of the animation there next to each other and on top of each other in these rows and columns. All right, what I'm going to do is go back to Unity, and I'm going to import both because we're going to look at how to do both methods. Okay, so I'll go back to the project tab, and I'm just going to drag in both the folder of PNG files and the sprite sheet PNG file. Now they're imported. If we go into this folder here, we can see each of those images there for each frame in the animation. What I'm going to do is drag the very first frame, the very first image into my scene. So I'm just going to add it up here on this platform. It's very small, but it is there. All right, so that's the first frame of the animation. All right, now what I'm going to do is select that object. It's already selected here in the hierarchy. I'm going to go to the animation panel, and I'm going to create a new animation. So I'll click create while this object is selected, the bubbles, and I'll save this in the animation folder within my sprites folder as bubble animation 1. All right, now instead of clicking on add property like I did earlier, what we're going to do is just drag and drop each image on for each frame on the timeline. And it's going to be easier if I move the project panel. Just going to click and drag that over to here so I can drag these images on for each frame onto the timeline where they belong. Okay, so I'm going to do that now, but I'm going to reduce the number of samples. I'm going to drop that down to about 10 samples per second. So here we can see each individual frame on the timeline, and I'm just going to drag the very first frame, or very first image there onto the first frame. And then actually I'll click on this little arrow here which will show that image, and then I can drag the second one on to the second frame, the third image on to the third frame, and so on. Okay, so just make sure that you drag these images into their correct order, correct position, one frame after the other. All right, and we can preview that by just dragging this bar along the timeline, frame by frame, or we can click on play here to actually see the animation running, and there it is. All right, I could slow that down. I might slow it down to 8 samples. And that's it. So that's how to do frame by frame animation where you have separate image files for each frame in the animation. Now what I'll show you is another method, and I'm going to move this project panel back down here again. Whoops. All right, this method is going to be using the sprite sheet. So remember I exported a sprite sheet here. It's an image file containing every single frame in the animation in a grid. Okay, so if you've got a sprite sheet like that, what you can do is click on that file, and I'm just going to zoom out here because I'm going to add this animation somewhere else. You click on that file. Over here in the inspector panel where it says sprite mode, change that from single to multiple. Okay, so this is not an image containing one single sprite or a frame for the animation, it's containing multiple sprites or multiple frames for the animation. So I'm changing the sprite mode to multiple. Where it says pixels per unit, that is the width or height of the sprite or the image. So mine was 64 by 64 pixels. That's the resolution. So where it says pixels per unit, I'll type in 64. And then click on the sprite editor, apply. And so you'll see all of the different frames or images that are going to be used for this animation. What you can actually do is click this little drop down arrow here, change type to grid by cell size, and then click slice. And what Unity does is actually, it takes that pixels per unit that we specified, 64 pixels, and it slices this image up into blocks that are each 64 by 64 pixels. So what we have here is each individual frame for the animation in this one image file, but it's all sliced up so that Unity can break these up into individual frames for the animation. So once you've sliced it, close that panel and you can click save. And now you'll notice if that image is selected, you'll notice that there's now a grid. There's rows and columns on that image. And if you click this little arrow here next to it, you can also see the individual frames there. Okay, so this is really easy now. Using a sprite sheet and slicing that sprite sheet, now all that I need to do to turn this into an animation is basically just drag it into my scene where I want this animation to appear and give this animation a name. I'm going to save it in the animations folder. I'm going to call this one Bubble Animation 2. Click on save, and that's it. It's created an animation from that sprite sheet. So I can click play to run the game and test that and actually see the animation in the game. And so that animation is playing. It does look a little bit different to the other animation because it's just running at a faster frame rate and it's a little bit bigger, but I can easily change that because it's been turned into an animation. I can just select that asset in the scene, in the hierarchy, go to the animation panel and change the number of samples there per second. So I think I used 10. No, I used 8 for the other animation, so I'll make this one 8 as well. And if I wanted to scale it down to the same size as the other one, I could use the scale tool to resize that animation, but I'm just going to leave it as is. So that's two ways of doing frame by frame animation, either using separate image files for each frame in the animation or using a sprite sheet that contains all the frames for the animation in one file and slicing it. In the next few videos, we're going to look at how to animate the player. So we'll have walking and running animations and jump animations and idle. And also we might even add some animations for climbing the ladders. So to do that, we're going to need to look at how to use the animation controller to specify when each animation can play. And we'll also be writing some code as well. All right, that's it for this video though. Thanks for watching.